New York is transforming fast. Beneath its streets, new tunnels are being carved. Above ground, billions are being poured into transforming its biggest airport into a next-generation global hub. And across Manhattan, new megaprojects are redefining the skyline. This is a race to keep one of the world's most important cities moving. The Big Apple is taking on some of the most complex, expensive, and ambitious megaprojects in its history. And these megaprojects can define its future for generations. Stay tuned as we bring you the 10 biggest megaprojects under construction in New York. New York no longer has the tallest skyscraper in the world, but to this day, its skyline remains the most recognizable in the world. And its most iconic fixture is the Empire State Building. Wherever you are in the city, it's a view that attracts millions towards it every year. For most of New York's modern history, this Art Deco crown climbing above Midtown has been the most recognizable silhouette in one of the most photographed cities on Earth. However, that iconic view is no longer fully visible from Fifth Avenue. That's because in 2023, something else started growing in front of it. It's a new skyscraper, different from many of Manhattan's behemoths, and it has created controversy from the beginning. By the time it topped out in April 2024, the Empire State View was gone. This new skyscraper had planted itself almost directly in the sightline, and New Yorkers were furious. That tower is 262 Fifth Avenue, and the story of how it got there is almost as controversial as the building itself. It all began in 2015 when an Israeli-Russian billionaire named Boris Kuznets began quietly buying up 3 adjacent parcels at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 29th Street. The purchases totaled around $102 million, with an additional investment in air rights that allowed the project to reach far beyond what normal zoning would permit. Kuznets wasn't new to building for the ultra-wealthy. He's the man credited with transforming Ostojenka Street in Moscow into the city's version of Billionaire's Row. In 2006, he told the New York Times that, "It's hard for oligarchs to live in a regular building." Now he was bringing that same philosophy to Fifth Avenue. The original plan, filed in 2016, called for a tower crossing the 1,000-foot super-tall threshold, designed by Meganom, a Moscow-based architecture firm making their first American project. The design went through multiple rounds of changes. The height climbed above 1,000 feet, then got pulled back to 860. The unit count dropped from 41 apartments to 26. The site sat largely dormant through the pandemic years before construction finally began in earnest in 2022. What eventually rose from that 5,000-square-foot plot, roughly the size of a suburban family home, is a tower with a height-to-width ratio of 19:1, making it the second thinnest skyscraper in New York after the Steinway Tower on 57th Street. At 860 feet, it isn't entering super-tall territory, but at that slenderness ratio, height alone doesn't tell the full story of what the building has to deal with, because buildings this thin move, not metaphorically, physically. All tall buildings sway in the wind, but at extreme slenderness ratios, those forces become genuinely difficult to manage. A few blocks north on Billionaire's Row, 432 Park Avenue, once the tallest residential building in the Western Hemisphere at nearly 1,400 feet, became a cautionary tale about exactly this problem. Residents there sued developers for $125 million, citing catastrophic flooding, elevators grinding to a halt during high winds because the sway was slapping the cables around in the shaft, and noise described as intolerable, creaking walls, whistling air, a trash chute that reportedly sounded like a bomb going off. One resident was trapped in an elevator for an hour and a half on a windy Halloween night. Engineers who worked on that building confirmed the same problems were happening quietly in other super-talls across the city. 262 Fifth Avenue uses a tuned mass damper, a large counterweight near the top that shifts in the opposite direction to the building's movement, absorbing the energy before residents feel it. But so did 432 Park Avenue, and that building's residents still ended up in court. Whether 26 apartments stacked 860 feet in the air on a 5,000-square-foot plot will fare better remains an open question, one that only time and a few serious storms will answer. Meanwhile, the controversy on the ground hasn't gone away. The Russian Connection, a developer with deep Moscow ties, a Moscow-based architecture firm, drew intense public scrutiny, particularly after 2022. Kuznets has been careful to point out he was born in Latvia and emigrated to Israel decades ago, and that calling the project Russian-backed mischaracterizes it. But Meganom is a Russian firm. The original clientele model came directly from Moscow's luxury market, and in New York in 2022 and beyond, that association wasn't easy to shake. And then there's the view. That's the one that really stings for a lot of people. The Empire State Building has been the anchor of the Midtown skyline from the south for nearly a century. It's not just a building, it's a reference point, a landmark so deeply embedded in the city's identity that its absence from a familiar sightline feels like something has been taken. The pedestrian plaza south of Madison Square Park was one of those sightlines. Now it isn't. Facade work is in its final stages, and the building is expected to complete later this year. When it does, it will be the tallest residential building on Fifth Avenue, rising from a footprint smaller than most people's backyards, stirring arguments that will probably outlast the building itself. For the first 10 years of its existence, the New York City Football Club had no home. The only MLS team based inside the 5 boroughs of New York City spent a decade sharing Yankee Stadium with a baseball team. They played some matches at Citi Field, and on at least one occasion moved a playoff match to a stadium in Connecticut. That was the reality of being New York's soccer club without a ground to call your own. That changes in 2027, and where it changes is one of the most unlikely patches of land in Queens. A century ago, Scott Fitzgerald published The Great Gatsby and described a stretch of Queens as the Valley of Ashes, a desolate industrial wasteland where men moved through clouds of gray dust, grinding away at the margins of a city that had no use for them. He was talking about Willets Point, but now that Valley of Ashes is turning into a 25,000 capacity soccer stadium. But the stadium is only part of what's going up at Willets Point. The full 23-acre development includes 2,500 units of affordable housing, the largest all-affordable project in the city in 40 years. There's a school, a hotel, and 40,000 square feet of public open space. All of it built on land the city spent a century failing to clean up. The first affordable housing units are already opening to residents before the stadium hosts a single game. The stadium itself is moving fast. Groundbreaking was December 2024. 6 months later, the first steel was going in. By March 2026, the entire structural frame was complete and topped out on schedule. The design by HOK puts a 7-story LED structure called the Cube at the entrance, 11,000 square feet of screen wrapping the exterior. The club compared it to the Las Vegas Sphere. Whether that holds up or not, the stadium is already booked for the 2028 Olympic football tournament as part of the Los Angeles Games, confirmed as an Olympic venue before a single competitive match has been played there. There is one number that keeps coming up in the conversation around this project. The city's independent budget office calculated that because NYCFC pays no property taxes over their 49-year lease, New York City stands to lose $538 million in tax revenue over the life of the deal. The Economic Development Corporation disputes the methodology. That fight will last longer than the stadium construction. NYCFC will spend the short 2027 MLS transition season playing its final matches at Yankee Stadium and Citi Field. Then, summer 2027, Etihad Park opens. A club that spent a decade as a tenant in other people's buildings gets a place of its own, built on ground that was a junkyard within living memory. Etihad Park is the most visible thing being built in Queens right now. But running underneath the borough and underneath the river and underneath an entire lake is something you will never see, and it may end up mattering more. New York City runs on roughly 11,000 megawatts of electricity on a peak summer day. Most of that power is generated by gas plants, many of them clustered along the western Queens waterfront in a neighborhood locals have long called Asthma Alley, named for the air quality that comes with having that much fossil fuel combustion concentrated in one place. The city has been trying to change that equation for years. The Champlain Hudson Power Express is how it actually gets done. The idea has been in development since the mid-2000s, when George W. Bush was president and the iPhone didn't exist. The concept was straightforward. Hydro-Quebec, the Canadian provincial utility, operates one of the largest hydropower networks on Earth, a vast system of dams and reservoirs in northern Quebec generating far more electricity than the province needs. New York City, just 339 miles south, was burning gas to keep its lights on. The question was how to connect them. The answer was a cable, not an overhead power line cutting through forests and communities. Those projects have been fought and killed across the northeastern United States for decades. A buried cable, running entirely underground and underwater, invisible at the surface, from the Canadian border all the way to Queens. The largest fully buried transmission line ever built in North America. Construction started in November 2022, and what followed was an engineering operation unlike anything the region had seen. Two 5-inch high-voltage cables had to travel 339 miles through 8 New York counties, across 2 major lakes, and through the bed of the Hudson River. On land, crews trenched alongside railway corridors to avoid disturbing communities, securing more than 700 separate land use easements along the route. In Lake Champlain, specialist barges loaded with water jet equipment cut trenches into the lake bed, then laid the cable and buried it before moving on. A cable-lay vessel made a near 100-mile journey south across the lake, simultaneously laying and burying cable as it went. When the route entered the Hudson River south of Catskill, the same process repeated for 89 miles of riverbed. Getting into New York City was its own problem. The cables had to thread under the streets of Queens to reach their destination, a process one project official described as a literal hand weave, requiring 10 new manholes and more than 3 miles of new underground circuitry just to connect to Con Edison's existing grid. That destination is a converter station in Astoria, sitting on a site that until recently held 6 massive oil storage tanks containing 12 million gallons of No. 6 heavy fuel oil, connected by nearly 4 miles of industrial piping. All of it was removed before construction could begin. The site that received the electricity of the future spent decades storing the fuel of the past. It is now becoming the first former fossil fuel site ever converted into a grid-scale clean energy facility in New York City. Once operational, the line carries 1,250 megawatts of hydropower from Quebec, enough to power around 1 million homes, covering roughly 20% of New York City's annual electricity needs. The power travels as high-voltage direct current, which loses far less energy over long distances than conventional alternating current, making the 339-mile journey practical in a way that wouldn't have worked with older transmission technology. At the Astoria station, it gets converted to AC and fed into the city grid. The project went operational in spring 2026, completing a journey that began when the concept was first floated 2 decades ago and survived a decade of regulatory battles, environmental reviews, supply chain delays, and legal challenges from riverside communities concerned about cable burial depths and impacts on endangered Hudson River sturgeon. The head of engineering for the project, Bob Harrison, has worked in infrastructure for 40 years. When asked about the scale of what he had just built, he said, "This is far and away the largest project I have ever worked on. From Astoria, you'd never know it was there." New York City has 3 major airports. Together, they handled a record 146 million passengers in 2024, more than any other metropolitan area in the Western Hemisphere outside of London. JFK alone processed over 62 million of those, making it the busiest international gateway into North America. It sits on nearly 5,000 acres in Queens, operates 4 runways, and connects the city to over 100 countries. By every measure of scale and importance, it is one of the most consequential airports on Earth. However, for most of the last 2 decades, it was also one of the most complained about. Frommers called one of its terminals a decrepit, crumbling chunk of concrete. J.D. Power ranked all 3 New York airports among the worst in the country simultaneously, year after year, sometimes occupying the bottom 3 spots outright. When it rained at LaGuardia, brown water leaked through the ceiling into the terminal so reliably it became a meme. JFK, with its disconnected ring of terminals built by individual airlines over 5 separate decades, offered the special confusion of an airport where changing terminals required taking a train. The gates were often miles apart, and some of the buildings dated to the 1960s and had been patched rather than replaced ever since. For a city that handles 60 million international passengers a year and competes with London, Dubai, and Singapore as a global financial and cultural capital, the state of its airports was an embarrassment that had been acknowledged, studied, and largely ignored for a generation. JFK's structural problem was unique. Unlike LAX or Heathrow, which developed as unified campuses, JFK grew as a collection of independent terminals, each built, owned, and operated by a different airline or consortium, each with its own check-in halls, security lanes, and baggage systems, stitched together by the AirTrain people mover and connected to the outside world by a tangle of expressways that backed up through Queens on any Friday afternoon. When an airline changed hubs or went bankrupt, its terminal sat empty or was handed to another carrier that didn't quite fit. Terminal 3, the old Delta terminal, described as the worst airport terminal in the world by multiple publications, was demolished in 2013 and replaced by a gravel lot for years before anything was done with the land. Terminal 2, built in 1962, kept operating until it was finally closed. The result was an airport that felt less like a planned facility and more like a city that had grown without zoning. The $19 billion transformation currently underway is the most comprehensive reimagining of a major American airport since the construction era of the mid-20th century. The centerpiece is the new Terminal 1, a $9.5 billion facility being built on the footprints of the demolished Terminal 2, the former Terminal 3 lot, and the existing Terminal 1, which will be torn down in phases as construction advances. Designed by Gensler around a butterfly form with a central spine and wings extending to each gate cluster, the terminal is built entirely on a single level. No basement customs halls, no underground corridors, no floors of stairs between arriving passengers and their luggage. Floor-to-ceiling windows run the length of the departures hall, flooding the building with daylight in a deliberate inversion of everything the old JFK terminals felt like. When the first 13 gates open in mid-2026, the building will already be roughly the combined size of LaGuardia's 2 new terminals. When the final 9 gates complete the build in 2030, it will be the largest terminal at JFK at 2.6 million square feet, with 23 gates dedicated exclusively to international travel. Airlines already confirmed for the new terminal include Air France, Korean Air, Turkish Airlines, Etihad, Qatar Airways, China Airlines, Air New Zealand, and more than a dozen others. Terminal 6, a $4.2 billion facility on the north side of the airport, is rising on the site of the old Terminal 7, which British Airways used for decades before it was folded into Terminal 8. JFK Millennium Partners, the private consortium building it, is targeting first gate openings in early 2026, with the second phase beginning once Terminal 7 is fully vacated and demolished. The building is designed as a boutique international terminal, smaller and more focused than Terminal 1, with a digital-first passenger experience and sustainability features built into the structure. Beyond the 2 new terminals, Delta has completed a $1.5 billion expansion of Terminal 4 that consolidates all its JFK operations under one roof, ending the era of Delta passengers shuttling between buildings. American Airlines has finished a $125 million retail overhaul of Terminal 8. JetBlue has completed renovations to Terminal 5. Roadway improvements around the airport's perimeter are addressing the ground access problem that has plagued the site for decades. The timing is deliberate and tight. The 2026 FIFA World Cup brings MetLife Stadium in New Jersey into play as one of the competition's primary venues, which means the city's airports will see a surge of international arrivals in the summer of 2026. Terminal 1's first phase is scheduled to open directly into that window. The 2028 Olympics, while centered on Los Angeles, will draw global visitors to New York as well. Both events have served as forcing functions for a transformation that had been planned, delayed, and replanned for the better part of 20 years. LaGuardia has already shown what the renovation of a New York airport can accomplish. It went from last place in passenger satisfaction surveys in 2018 to first place in its category 4 years later after its own multi-billion-dollar rebuild. JFK is a larger, more complex, more historically fractured campus. What was voted the ugliest airport in the world is being rebuilt as a genuine international gateway. Whether it ends up rivaling Singapore's Changi or Dubai's Terminal 3 remains to be seen. But by 2030, the airport that generations of New Yorkers accepted as a necessary humiliation will look nothing like what it does today. JFK is New York's gateway to the world. The next project is about fixing something far more local: the fact that 2 of the city's 5 boroughs, home to 5 million people, still can't get between them without going through Manhattan first. Brooklyn and Queens share a border. They sit next to each other on a map, separated in places by nothing wider than a street. Together, they house around 5 million people, more than the population of Los Angeles. And yet, if you live in Borough Park and need to get to Jackson Heights, the whole trip takes the better part of an hour. On a map, it looks absurd. In practice, it is the daily reality for nearly 1 million people. There is no direct rail connection between Brooklyn and Queens. There never has been. That is not an oversight. It is a consequence of how New York's subway was built, radiating outward from Manhattan like spokes on a wheel, designed to funnel workers into the central business district and back home again. Cross-borough travel, the kind that doesn't involve Manhattan at all, was never the priority. For most of the 20th century, that was a manageable inconvenience. In a city where the outer boroughs have grown into major employment and cultural centers of their own, it has become something closer to an infrastructure failure. The Interborough Express is the fix. The idea has been floating around for decades. The Regional Plan Association first proposed a version of it in 1996, calling it the Triborough RX, a rapid transit line connecting Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx along existing freight corridors. The concept was sound, the political will and the money were not. The proposal sat in planning documents for years, occasionally surfacing in policy discussions before disappearing again. Then in 2022, Governor Hochul directed the MTA to formally begin the process. By 2023, light rail had been selected as the mode. By 2025, $2.75 billion in funding was approved as part of the MTA's capital plan, and the project moved from planning into active design and engineering. The route runs 14 miles along an existing freight line with 19 stations along the way. But while the freight train has been running since Ulysses Grant was president, the people who live alongside it are still waiting for a seat. The IBX will run alongside them on dedicated tracks, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. End-to-end travel time, 32 minutes. The same journey by current transit options takes up to an hour, requires multiple transfers, and goes through Manhattan whether you want it to or not. The scale of what this line would unlock is significant. Nearly 900,000 people live in the neighborhoods along the route. Many of them sit in what transit planners call deserts, areas of Brooklyn and Queens with minimal subway access, where getting anywhere requires a combination of buses, trains, and transfers that can turn a 3-mile trip into a 45-minute ordeal. The IBX connects them directly to 17 subway lines and the Long Island Railroad at East New York. A report by the New York Building Congress projected that rezoning along the corridor could unlock between 70,000 and 100,000 new housing units within a decade of the line opening. In a city with one of the worst housing shortages in the country, that number matters. However, not everyone along the route is enthusiastic. In November 2025, over 100 residents packed a high school auditorium in Middle Village, Queens, to tell the MTA the project was not needed or wanted in their neighborhood. Concerns centered on noise, disruption, and the character of quieter residential streets suddenly adjacent to a light rail line. The MTA responded by revising the design in that stretch, proposing a tunnel beneath Metropolitan Avenue rather than street-running tracks. That change cut the projected travel time from 39 minutes to 32 and pushed ridership projections up to 160,000 daily passengers. As of April 2026, the project is in its design and engineering phase, with a joint venture of Jacobs and HDR leading the work. The environmental review is running in parallel, with a draft environmental impact statement expected by late 2026. Construction is not expected to begin until the late 2020s, with the line operational in the early 2030s. The full cost is estimated at $5.5 billion, with half currently funded and the rest dependent on future capital allocations. There is also the curious question of what to call it. In August 2025, MTA officials briefly rebranded the IBX as a high-capacity light metro, a distinction that seemed to vanish within months. By April 2026, the agency was back to calling it Light Rail. The name change lasted less than a year. The project itself has already outlasted 3 decades of false starts, and for the first time it has money behind it and engineers on the ground. The Interborough Express will eventually give Brooklyn and Queens something they've never had. The next project is about fixing something that exists and has been failing the people who use it every single day for decades. Every weekday, around 250,000 people pass through the Port Authority bus terminal on the west side of Midtown Manhattan. That makes it the busiest bus terminal on Earth, busier than any in London, Tokyo, or anywhere else. It handles over 65 million passengers a year, connecting New York City to New Jersey, Long Island, and intercity routes up and down the East Coast. By sheer volume of human movement, it is one of the most important transit facilities in the Western Hemisphere. It was built in 1950. The last time it was significantly upgraded was 1979, the year the Walkman came out. Since then, it has been patched, bandaged, and criticized by essentially everyone who has ever walked through it. Cracked floors, crumbling ceiling tiles, a maze-like layout that confuses regular commuters and defeats first-time visitors entirely. Poorly lit corridors, bathrooms that have become a recurring subject of complaint for decades. During rush hour, the overcrowding reaches a level that would be unacceptable in almost any other public building in a city that considers itself the capital of the world. The Port Authority's own executive director once stood in front of reporters and called it out of date, long overdue to be replaced. The agency has been studying what to do about it since at least 2013. In those years, it conducted no fewer than 5 separate studies on rebuilding the terminal. None of them produced construction. Plans were presented, costs were debated, board members revolted, and proposals were shelved. In 2015, a $9 billion rebuild plan was rejected by the Port Authority Board as too expensive. The terminal kept deteriorating. The studies kept accumulating. The fundamental problem, beyond the politics, is engineering. The Port Authority bus terminal sits on one of the most constrained sites in Midtown Manhattan. Rebuilding it requires using the heaviest structural steel pieces in the world. The building has to span the Lincoln Tunnel Expressway and Dyer Avenue below grade while remaining operational above. You cannot simply close a terminal that 250,000 people use every day. Every phase of construction has to work around a building that never stops. That is why a project of this complexity costs $10 billion and takes until 2032 to complete. That $10 billion figure cleared its final regulatory hurdle in December 2024, when the Federal Transit Administration issued its record of decision following the environmental review. In January 2025, the U.S. Department of Transportation disbursed a $1.89 billion federal loan toward the project. On May 29, 2025, shovels went into the ground. Construction is proceeding in phases. The first stage involves building 2 deckovers above the below-grade sections of Dyer Avenue and the Lincoln Tunnel Expressway between West 37th and 39th Streets. These decks serve a double purpose. During construction, they provide space to stage and store buses off city streets, solving a problem that has plagued the terminal for years, as empty buses between the morning and evening rush currently deadhead back to New Jersey because there is nowhere to put them in Manhattan. When construction is complete, those same decks become nearly 4 acres of publicly accessible green space. one of the largest new open spaces added to this part of Midtown in decades. Phase 1, the deckovers, new bus storage facilities, and new ramps directly connecting to the Lincoln Tunnel, is expected to complete by 2028. The main terminal itself, a 2.1 million square foot building on the same footprint as the existing one, opens around 2032. When it does, capacity goes from 600 buses per hour to over 1,000. The new terminal is designed to handle NJ Transit's incoming electric bus fleet, with a soaring multi-story atrium entrance on 41st Street, street-facing retail, and a layout that people can actually navigate. The full project, including all supporting infrastructure, runs to 2040. There is a sculpture inside the current terminal called The Commuters, 3 life-size bronze figures by George Segal, each one slumped in exhaustion, staring into middle distance. It was installed in 1982. For 40 years, it has served as an accidental monument to the experience of using this building. When the new terminal opens in 2032, the commuters will presumably move with it. Whether the people they depict will finally have something less exhausting to arrive at is the whole point of the $10 billion. The Port Authority bus terminal has been deteriorating in plain sight for decades. Everyone can see the problem. Everyone knows what needs to be done. The next entry has been under construction since 1970, 800 feet beneath a city that has almost no idea it exists. And it is finally, almost done. Somewhere in the Catskill Mountains, about 125 miles north of Manhattan, rain falls on protected watershed land and collects in a network of 19 reservoirs. From there, gravity does all the work. The water moves south through 3 major aqueduct systems, the Croton, the Catskill, and the Delaware, carved through bedrock over a century of engineering, carrying roughly 1.3 billion gallons a day toward one of the most densely populated places on Earth. No pumps for 97% of the journey, just elevation difference and the physics of water moving downhill through stone. It is one of the great feats of civil engineering in American history, and almost nobody who benefits from it knows it exists. By the time that water reaches New York City, it flows into 2 distribution tunnels that carry it into the 5 boroughs. Tunnel number 1 was completed in 1917, tunnel number 2 in 1936. Together, they have been running continuously for between 90 and 109 years. Neither has ever been shut down, not for a day, not for an hour. The valves that would be needed to take either tunnel offline were installed at the beginning and have never been turned. Engineers believe that operating them now, after a century of immobility, could cause them to fail entirely. The tunnels have known leaks, losing millions of gallons a day into the surrounding bedrock. But fixing them requires shutting off the water, which nobody has been able to do. For decades, inspection of these tunnels has been simply impossible. If tunnel number 2 failed today, a fracture, a collapse, any kind of catastrophic failure, the boroughs of Brooklyn and Queens, which depend almost entirely on that single pipe, would be without water for an estimated 3 months. Former Mayor Bloomberg stood 200 feet below Central Park in 2013 and said it plainly, "God forbid one of 2 tunnels suffers a collapse. We just cannot live without water." The city has known this problem existed since 1954, when it authorized the construction of a 3rd tunnel that would finally provide enough redundancy to take the older 2 offline for inspection and repair. Construction of water tunnel number 3 began in 1970. After 62 years, it is nearly finished. At over 60 miles long and running up to 500 feet below street level through some of the hardest bedrock in the northeastern United States, it is the largest capital construction project in New York City history. The men who built it are called sandhogs, members of Local 147, the Tunnel Workers Union, whose lineage of underground work in New York stretches back to the Brooklyn Bridge caissons in the 1870s. They work in conditions that are loud, dark, and unforgiving, drilling and blasting through Manhattan schist and outer borough bedrock hundreds of feet below streets that have no idea they're there. Since 1970, 24 people have died building tunnel number 3. 23 were workers. The 24th was a 12-year-old boy named Don Ray Carroll, who fell 500 feet down an uncapped riser shaft while exploring a construction site in the Bronx. Near Van Cortlandt Park, there is a memorial to the 23 workers. 23 manhole covers set into the ground, each bearing a name: Charles Backey, Joseph Barton, Stuart Birdsall, Frank Senior, men who died building something the city would never see. The tunnel has come online in stages. The first section, running from Yonkers through Manhattan, began delivering water in 1998. The Manhattan section opened in 2013. The Brooklyn and Queens sections, the final stretch, serving the boroughs most dependent on the aging Tunnel Number 2, are now in their final construction phase, with completion expected in 2032. When those sections activate, Water Tunnel Number 1 will be shut down for inspection for the first time since Woodrow Wilson was president. Engineers will go inside a pipe that has been carrying water without interruption since 1917 and document what 115 years of continuous use has done to it. Nobody knows exactly what they will find. The repair bill could be manageable. It could be something else entirely. The project has cost over $6 billion and taken 6 decades, outlasting every mayor who championed it, every deadline that was set for it, and every prediction about when it would finish. Bloomberg set a completion target of 2021. De Blasio said 2020, then 2025. The current answer is 2032. The head of engineering on the project has worked in infrastructure for 40 years. When asked recently about the scale of what has been built, he said simply, "This is far and away the largest project I have ever worked on. When it is complete, nothing visible will change. There will be no new skyline, no station opening, no ribbon cutting. The aqueducts will keep bringing water down from the Catskills. The city will keep running. The only difference is that for the first time in over a century, New York will have a way out if one of those old tunnels finally gives." After 62 years, this important piece of NYC water infrastructure is nearing completion. The next project has been failing to get built for even longer. Nearly a century of promises, false starts, and one of the most extraordinary sagas in the history of American infrastructure. In September 1929, the New York City Board of Transportation approved plans for a new subway line running under 2nd Avenue, from the Harlem River all the way down to the southern tip of Manhattan. The estimated cost was $98.9 million. Service was expected to begin by 1940. Then the stock market crashed. What followed is one of the longest-running infrastructure failures in American history. The Great Depression killed the funding. World War II suspended all non-essential construction. The city's fiscal crisis in the 1970s wiped out a fresh attempt. Tunnels had actually been dug on the Upper East Side before the money ran out and the holes were sealed. For decades, the 2nd Avenue subway existed as a running joke about New York's inability to build anything. Gene Rushinoff, a subway advocate who had been pushing for the line since 1981, put it plainly, "It's the most famous thing that's never been built in New York City. It's much promised and never delivered." Phase 1 finally opened on New Year's Day, 2017, 88 years after the original approval. 3 stations, 1.8 miles of new track. The Q train extended from 57th Street to 96th Street on the Upper East Side. It was the first major subway expansion in New York City in 50 years, and it worked. In its first months, 150,000 people a day used it, overcrowding on the Lexington Avenue line. The 4, 5, and 6 trains, which had been carrying over 1 million passengers a day and running at well beyond capacity, dropped by 30%. The logic of building the line had been sound all along. It just took nearly a century to act on it. The cost was $4.45 billion for 1.8 miles. At $2.5 billion per mile, it was 8 to 12 times more expensive than comparable subway projects built at the same time in Rome, Istanbul, Stockholm, Paris, Berlin, and Madrid. The MTA ran into uncharted utilities, unknown building encroachments, and soil conditions nobody had mapped. Upper East Side residents complained about blasting hours. The project opened 5 years late. It was, by the standards of New York infrastructure, a qualified success, which is to say it was finished, it worked, and it only cost twice what it should have. Phase 2 picks up where Phase 1 left off at 96th Street and pushes north another 1.5 miles into East Harlem, adding stations at 106th Street, 116th Street, and a new terminal at 125th Street and Lexington Avenue. That last station connects to the 4, 5, and 6 trains and to Metro North, turning it into one of the most significant transit hubs in Upper Manhattan. East Harlem is one of the most transit-dependent neighborhoods in the city and one of the most underserved. When the 2nd Avenue elevated railway was torn down in 1942, the community was promised a replacement. That promise is now 84 years old. In August 2025, the MTA awarded the largest tunneling contract in agency history, nearly $2 billion, to begin boring the new tunnels. Heavy civil construction started in early 2026. The tunnel boring machines, 750-ton instruments with 22-foot diamond-studded drill heads, are expected to begin digging in 2027, working between 35 and 120 feet below 2nd Avenue. The MTA has been explicit about the lessons it learned from Phase 1. Extensive geotechnical surveys done in advance, utilities relocated before construction starts, insurance structured to reduce financial risk. Every preparatory step that was skipped or rushed in Phase 1 has been completed first this time. Then came the money fight. In October 2025, the Trump administration withheld $18 billion in combined federal funding for the 2nd Avenue subway and the Gateway program, citing what it described as unconstitutional diversity practices in contracting. The MTA threatened to sue. By early 2026, the fight was still unresolved, with the MTA's chair warning publicly that funding delays at the front end of a project like this have a way of cascading into delays at the back end. The project is estimated to cost around $6 billion for 1.5 miles. If Phase 1 is any guide, that number will move. Construction is expected to complete sometime in the early 2030s, at which point Phase 3, pushing the line south from 125th Street to Houston Street, would begin, followed eventually by a final phase into Lower Manhattan. The full vision from 1929, 16 stations running the length of Manhattan, is projected to cost over $17 billion in total and would carry 560,000 riders a day when complete. For now, the tunneling machines are being assembled, the money fight is ongoing, and East Harlem is still waiting. The 2nd Avenue subway is a story about a promise made and broken across a century. The next one is about a promise that was kept and then deliberately destroyed. In 1910, the Pennsylvania Railroad opened a train station in Midtown Manhattan that was, by most accounts, one of the finest buildings in America. The main waiting room alone was the largest indoor space in New York City, modeled on the great Roman baths of Caracalla, with 84 granite Doric columns and vaulted ceilings that let natural light pour down through iron and glass. 100 million passengers passed through it in 1945 alone. It was the busiest rail terminal in the world, and it looked like it. By 1963, it was gone. The Pennsylvania Railroad's ridership had collapsed in the post-war years as cars and cheap air travel pulled passengers away. The building was enormous, expensive to maintain, and sitting on some of the most valuable real estate on Earth. In 1962, the railroad struck a deal: demolish the station, surrender the air rights above the tracks, and receive in return a smaller underground station at no cost and a stake in a new development above it. That development was Madison Square Garden. The architectural community protested, rallies were held, "Don't amputate, renovate" was chanted outside the building. Nobody in power listened. Demolition began on October 28, 1963. The New York Times called it a monumental act of vandalism. The destruction was so shocking that it directly led to the creation of New York City's Landmarks Preservation Law in 1965. Too late to save Penn Station, in time to save Grand Central. The architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable captured the feeling that persisted for decades afterward. We will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. What replaced the original station is what 600,000 people walk through every day today, the busiest rail hub in North America, serving Amtrak, NJ Transit, and the Long Island Railroad. buried in a basement beneath a sports arena. The ceilings are low, the corridors are narrow and confusing. During rush hour, the platforms are so overcrowded that the MTA has experimented with regulating the flow of passengers from above, holding people at the top of the stairs to prevent dangerous conditions below. The whole station smells like a basement because it is one. Penn Station has been described as an infrastructure failure, a civic embarrassment, and simply the worst building in New York. All three are accurate. Plans to fix it have been circulating for decades. The problem is threefold. First, Madison Square Garden sits directly on top of it, owned by James Dolan, whose family has operated the arena under a special permit since 1963. Moving the garden has been proposed repeatedly and dismissed repeatedly. Dolan renewed his operating permit in 2023. Second, the station handles 600,000 passengers every single day and cannot close for construction. Every beam you raise, every wall you move, every ceiling you lift has to happen while that volume of people keeps moving through. The MTA's own engineers have described it as trying to perform open-heart surgery on a patient who insists on running a marathon during the procedure. Third, the cost. The current renovation plan is estimated at $7 billion for a project that by its nature can only be done in pieces, at night, around a schedule that never stops. In April 2025, the Trump administration took the project away from the MTA entirely, transferring control to Amtrak and the Department of Transportation. The stated reason was that the MTA had proved it was incapable of delivering major infrastructure on time or on budget. The federal government withdrew $72 million in existing grants, then turned around and provided $43 million to Amtrak to begin the new procurement process. Governor Hochul responded by announcing New York State would no longer contribute the $1.3 billion it had previously committed. Andy Byford, the former NYC Transit president known to the public as Train Daddy for turning around the subway system, was appointed as Amtrak's special advisor to lead the rebuild. In August 2025, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy stood outside Penn Station and announced construction would begin by the end of 2027. A master developer would be selected by May 2026. The plans include a new commuter train hall, wider concourses, new entrances, green space, and better signage. Whether Madison Square Garden moves remains officially unresolved. Byford said the proposals would be evaluated and the question of the garden decided over time. When a reporter asked Duffy if the rebuilt station would be renamed after Trump, he said, "I think that is a nice ring to it." What actually emerges from this, a genuinely transformed station, a cosmetically improved basement, or another decade of studies, will depend on whether the money holds, whether the politics settle, and whether anyone can figure out how to build something meaningful inside a building that 600,000 people refuse to stop using. The original Penn Station took 3 years to demolish and 60 years to mourn. What comes next has been promised, argued over, and debated so many times that even the people who want it most have learned not to hold their breath. Penn Station has been a problem for 60 years. The next project is about something that has been a catastrophe waiting to happen for even longer. And the moment it does happen, it doesn't just affect New York. It shuts down the entire East Coast. Under the Hudson River, between New Jersey and Manhattan, there are 2 rail tunnels. They were built between 1904 and 1910. Woodrow Wilson was still a university president when construction started. Every single day, roughly 200,000 passengers travel through them on NJ Transit and Amtrak trains. More train movements per day than any other rail corridor in the Western Hemisphere. The Northeast Corridor, the line running from Washington to Boston that those tunnels feed into, carries more passengers than all domestic U.S. air routes combined on its most congested stretches. In October 2012, Hurricane Sandy flooded both tunnels with salt water. Salt water doesn't just damage concrete and steel, it corrodes it from the inside in ways that are invisible until they aren't. Amtrak engineers have been managing that damage ever since. They have been very clear about what happens if one of those tunnels fails catastrophically. The other one, already running at full capacity, cannot absorb the load. The Northeast Corridor effectively shuts down. Trains from Washington to Boston stop. The economic impact has been estimated at around $100 million per day. There is no backup. There has never been a backup. The Gateway program is the backup. At its core, Gateway means building 2 new tunnels under the Hudson to sit alongside the existing ones, creating 4 tracks where there are currently 2, doubling capacity. And finally, allowing the century-old North River tunnels to be taken offline for the first time in their existence for full rehabilitation. The full program is 10 separate construction projects along a 10-mile stretch between Newark Penn Station and New York Penn Station at a total cost of $16 billion. It is the most expensive and most consequential infrastructure project in America right now. Construction began in November 2023. By the summer of 2025, 5 separate construction sites were active across New Jersey and Manhattan. 2 tunnel boring machines, each as long as a football field, each weighing nearly 1,700 tons, were manufactured in Germany by Herrenknecht, the same firm that built the TBMs for New York's East Side Access tunnels. The machines were tested at the factory, shipped across the Atlantic, trucked to a launch site in North Bergen, New Jersey, and assembled in pieces at the base of the Palisades. Crews stabilized 5,500 square meters of Hudson riverbed. A slurry wall was completed around the Hudson County access shaft in Weehawken, creating a watertight perimeter for underground excavation. A concrete casing under Hudson Yards in Manhattan, preserving the underground right-of-way for the new tunnel's Manhattan connection, was 50% complete. Then, the money stopped. In October 2025, the Trump administration froze $18 billion in combined federal funding for Gateway and the Second Avenue subway, citing what it described as unconstitutional diversity practices in contracting. Work continued for weeks on existing funds and a line of credit the Gateway Development Commission had secured. Then, on February 6, 2026, construction halted. Nearly 1,000 workers were sent home. The construction sites, which weeks earlier had been among the most active in the country, went quiet. One of the Gateway commissioners described them as ghost towns. The political fight that followed moved faster than most infrastructure disputes. The New York and New Jersey attorneys general sued the Trump administration. On February 6th, a judge issued a temporary restraining order requiring the release of over $200 million in overdue funds. The money came in pieces, $30 million, then $77 million, then the remaining balance. By February 18th, all frozen funds had been released and workers were returning to the sites. Trump had, at one point, said he would release the funds if Penn Station and Dulles Airport were renamed after him. That offer, according to reports, did not land. As of March 2026, the TBM components for the first machine had arrived at the North Bergen portal site. The second machine was en route. Crews had restarted work inside the cofferdam in the Hudson River, preparing the ground for the boring machines using deep soil mixing to reinforce the sediment. Tunneling, which was scheduled to begin in mid-2026, is expected to resume on that timeline. The project's target completion date remains 2035. The North River tunnels are now 116 years old. They were designed to last 50. Every day that the new ones aren't built is another day that 2 tubes of corroding concrete carrying 200,000 people through the floor of the Hudson River are the only thing keeping the East Coast rail network running. They haven't failed yet. Which of these mega projects impresses you the most? And which one would you like to see completed soon? Let us know in the comments below. For a more detailed story of what America is building, check out our documentary on the biggest mega projects under construction in USA. Keep following Signum, and we will see you in the next video.